It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show on this cold and rainy, dreary Saturday afternoon in central Pennsylvania. Remember, this is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And thanks for tuning in on WHP 580 and iHeartRadio. If you'd like to watch prior podcasts of the show or listen to prior podcasts of the show or read any of my columns on Penn Live or take a look at some great merchandise we have, including our very popular Right to Bear Arms muscle shirt or the We're Glad You're Our Neighbor, Just Please Don't Kill Us yard signs, go to the markscaringishow.com website. They'll make perfect and beautiful, as the president would describe them, Christmas presents for friends and family. And for more political and legal news throughout the course of the week, don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Well, they did it. In only the third time in U.S. history, the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach the President of the United States. I should say Democrats on the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach the President of the United States in a purely partisan party line vote. And rest assured, the Democratic majority in the House will vote to impeach as soon as it takes up these newly passed impeachment articles. Well, Democrats have undoubtedly scored a major victory against President Trump, which they set out to do since the day he was elected. Yet, in my opinion, this will turn out to be a Pyrrhic victory, as it will cost them the U.S. Congress and the presidency in 2020. The American people will not forgive or forget Democrats for what they have done to this president in this impeachment process. For the first time in the history of the United States, a president will be impeached for a non-criminal act. Even the universally condemned and failed impeachment of President Andrew Johnson way back in 1868 included a crime, albeit one fabricated by the opposing political party in order to entrap Johnson. The American people did not stand for it then. They voted to acquit and will not, well, the Senate did, and will not stand for it now. And like Don Quixote of old, Democrats today are tilting at windmills. They've charged the president with two purportedly impeachable acts called abuse of power and abuse of Congress. But they can't even call them crimes or offenses because they're not. What are they then? Well, Democrats claim they're high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, if true, that would make them impeachable offenses under the United States Constitution. Yet, they're not. Again, they're not crimes. One will not find either abuse of power or abuse of Congress in the United States Crimes Code or in the common law of crimes in existence at the time of the framing of our Constitution. And yet they're not misdemeanors. Misdemeanors are crimes that are less serious than felonies. Nevertheless, the intrepid Democrats gallop forward, even though their facts don't meet the legal definition for impeachment. Now, the framers of our Constitution chose the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, which was a term in English common law, to mean serious crimes that involve the abuse of one's office, one's public office, in a way that breached the public trust and harmed the country, harmed the body politic. Thus, former President Bill Clinton's lying under oath about sex was a crime, but it was not a high crime because it didn't breach the public trust or harm the body politic or harm the country. So Clinton, like Andrew Johnson, was acquitted. But again, those two former presidents were impeached for committing crimes. Now, the Democrats' case against Trump is even worse than those two cases, the one against Johnson and the one against Clinton. Not only is there no crime, there aren't even true facts. Let's take a look. In the very first substantive sentence of Article 1, Democrats allege President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. Now, these words sound ominous, don't they? They also sound familiar, and like the Russian allegations before, are patently false. And as an aside, if you take that very first substantive sentence in Article 1 of the impeachment articles and you remove the word Ukraine and 2020 and replace it with Russia and 2016, you will have the allegation by Democrats against President Trump that he interfered in the colluded with the Russians to interfere in the 2016 presidential election, which served as the basis of the 3-year-long investigation into the president and the appointment of the special counsel Bob Mueller, his investigation, the thousands of subpoenas and court records or presidential records that were subpoenaed and obtained, the multitude of witnesses and depositions and hearings, and finally the Mueller report, which concluded that the president did not collude with the Russians, and Attorney General Barr's conclusion the president did not obstruct justice. That's just a quick aside. But getting back to Article 1, which passed in the House Judiciary Committee just a few days ago, again, it states President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. And my response to that allegation is it's patently false. Interfere, that's the word chosen, solicited the interference. Interfere means to interpose, hinder, or impede. Just look it up in the dictionary. The president asking the Ukrainians to investigate the Biden family is impeding or blocking the 2020 presidential election? No, it's nonsense. So President Trump asking the Ukrainian President Zelensky to look into or to investigate credible allegations that former Vice President Joe Biden and his son were involved in some sort of corruption in Ukraine does not hinder or block or prevent the 2020 presidential election. Yet that's what Democrats would have us believe in their Article 1 of the impeachment of this president. I'm sure you would agree that it is utter nonsense. Yet the Democrats' hyperbole, and that's really what it is, it has no bounds, because Democrats don't have a crime. They're trying to hype up Trump's conduct into something they believe is akin to one. Well, how? Well, by raising the heavily cliched boogeyman of the deep state. In Article 1, Democrats claim Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring or injuring national security and other vital national interests, and that by such conduct, Trump has demonstrated he will remain a threat to national security. And my response, really? How many of you out there who are listening to the show on WHP 580, how many of you are cowering in fear of an attack on the homeland of the United States because Trump paused military aid for a month or so to Ukraine? Really? That threatened the national security interests of the United States of America? You see, it's utter nonsense. More about the House Judiciary Committee's impeachment articles when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to The Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And yes, I'm speaking a little more subdued today. The wife and I were up late last night at a fantastic 1980s themed party hosted by Vlad and Bethany Serdar in honor of Bethany's birthday. And it was a wonderful event. And many of my friends who were there, associates, neighbors, said that they're avid listeners of the Mark Scaringi Show. They never miss a show every Saturday at 1 o'clock here on WHP 580. So we're going to have a little test to determine whether or not those were true statements uttered by friends of mine at the Serdar's wonderful 1980s bash. And I grew up in the 1980s, a young man coming of age in that wonderful decade, and I have concluded one thing, and this will be the test to see if any of my friends actually listen to the Mark Scaringi Show every Saturday, and that is Madonna sucks and Cyndi Lauper rules. So that is my characterization of the 1980s, and the next time I see you in the greater Camp Hill area, I'm going to ask you that one question, and we'll see if you listen to the show. Anyway, back to the theme and topic of the show today, the House Judiciary Committee's impeachment of the President of the United States. And we're going through the articles of impeachment and taking a close look at provisions of them. And we're focusing in on how Article 1 is the abuse of power, and Article 2 is the abuse of Congress, and how the facts alleged by the Democrats don't even fit the definition. Of course, they have not alleged crimes, let alone crimes or misdemeanors. And we're juxtaposing that with the prior impeachments of President Clinton, President Nixon, and also President Johnson. Those impeachment articles involved actual criminal acts. These do not. And of course, the Nixon impeachment abruptly halted when President Nixon resigned. Clinton and Johnson's impeachments made it through the respective houses and reached a dead end, a wall in the U.S. Senate, and both men were acquitted. But they were charged with crimes. And as I explained, even, albeit in the Johnson case, the Congress just kind of fabricated a crime for him and then entrapped him to commit the crime, and the way he committed it was the lawful exercise of his constitutional authority to fire the Secretary of War. But let's not get into that. The point is here, we have no crimes. The Democrats were unable to find them. So they've used language, abuse of power, abuse of Congress, and in the articles themselves, they've explained, they've justified this bad conduct they're purporting. With violations or with breaches or with threats to our national security. So they're trying to kind of hype up whatever it is that the president said to the Ukrainian president, whatever it is that Ambassador Sondland and others were trying to accomplish with the Ukrainians vis-a-vis the release of this aid. House Democrats are trying to ratchet that all the way up into something that seems like it would fit the definition of a high crime or misdemeanor, which, of course, it does not. But they're trying to scare us with the eternal boogeyman of the deep state, and that is, it's a threat to our national security. Everything is a threat to our national security. And that is the justification for the abuse of power impeachment, Article 1. That because the president solicited interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election, allegedly, that in and of itself threatened the national security interests of the United States. Now, of course, that's absurd. We've already explained how nothing the president did interfered in the 2020 presidential election, which, by the way, hasn't even happened yet. Remarkable, isn't that? That little factoid has escaped our Democratic friends. We haven't even had an election, a 2020 presidential election yet, so how could the president interfere with it? But of course, nothing the president has done interposed, hindered, impeded, blocked, or prevented that election from occurring. What they mean is the president was trying to influence the presidential election by calling for the Ukrainians to announce they're investigating Joe Biden. That is the characterization that they draw. The president will claim and has claimed that he was looking into, wanted the Ukrainians to look into and possibly investigate credible allegations of corruption involving Joe and Hunter Biden. But Democrats have characterized it in that way because they have to, because they have no actual crime to allege. So that's how we get Article 1. Now, Article 2, abuse of Congress. I think this is even worse than Article 1. Here, Democrats claim that by defying House subpoenas, now remember, the House Intelligence Committee had issued subpoenas to various members of the White House, high-ranking officials, top advisors, and I think we covered this a little bit last week, and two in particular, the acting chief of staff, Mr. Mick Mulvaney, and the incumbent, the current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, were subpoenaed, and they responded by saying they would not be complying with the subpoena. They alleged grounds why they should not be required to comply. Now, so Democrats then put this into an impeachment article. And in Article 2, they claim Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution. My response, well, the president has the right to resist congressional subpoenas, as he did here, by citing executive privilege. Now, in response to that argument, the Democratic Congress, they could have gone to court seeking a court order compelling the president to comply. The judiciary would then resolve the dispute. And if the judiciary ruled in the favor of Democrats, a judge would issue an order compelling the White House to comply with the subpoena. And had the White House refused to comply with a court order, then the White House would be in contempt of court. And that's exposing itself, exposing the president, Pompeo, Mulvaney, to serious jeopardy when you're in contempt of court. And that would, I think, be an impeachable offense. But that didn't happen. Congress chose not to use the actual constitutional process, the actual legal process that's set up, because of its own political calculations. Admittedly, Democrats feared that going to the courts would take too long and would obscure the 2020 presidential nomination contest. So Democrats didn't want news stories about the various battles within the federal courts as this case would have made its way up through the various levels of the federal courts. They anticipated that, and they didn't want those news stories to obscure or block or get in the way of their presidential nomination contest. It is a blatant political calculation. Adam Schiff talked about it at the press conference. That's the press conference that was convened by Speaker Pelosi, in which they took no questions, so it's hard to say it's a press conference. Adam Schiff explained it that way. Purely a political calculation by the Democrats not to use the courts, the third branch of government, the judiciary, to enforce the subpoena or the subpoenas. That's just so revelatory of what this impeachment process is all about. And the icing on this entirely politically baked cake is this. Now, President Trump has stated that once the impeachment reaches the United States Senate, he will ask the Senate to subpoena former Vice President Joe Biden, the purported Democratic presidential frontrunner, and remember, the purported or alleged victim in the Trump-Ukrainian matter. The Senate's going to, the president's going to request that Biden be subpoenaed to attend and testify at trial. Now, when asked if he would comply, Biden said this: "No, I will not yield to what everybody is looking for here, and that is to take the eye off the ball." That is his primary election contest. So Biden's stating he will defy a congressional subpoena, yet that's what Democrats are impeaching the president for, and Biden's stating he will do so for his own political benefit. He doesn't want to take the eye off the ball. He doesn't want to take the eye off his campaign. Is that ironic? Yes. The impeachment of President Trump is an obvious partisan sham. The American people will likely agree, and in response, mark my words, I predicted the victory of President Trump in 2016 well before anybody else did. I called that he would win Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, very early in that presidential contest. Mark my words. As the Democrats continue with this impeachment sham, it's going to cause them to lose the congressional elections. They're going to lose the House in 2020, and of course will not regain the presidency in 2020 as well. More about the impeachment when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to the Mark Scaringi Show.
Let's get back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And we're talking about the impeachment of the President of the United States by the Democratic-controlled House Judiciary Committee. And we've talked about the two articles of impeachment, 1 and 2, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. And we'll open up the phone banks, and we'll take some calls, and we'll hear from our listeners as to what they think about the important political and legal issues of the day, impeachment and others. So we'll hear from Gino from beautiful Murraysville, Pennsylvania. Gino, you're on the Mark Scaringi Show.
Buddy.
Yes, Gino, go ahead.
Oh, I'm the guy you know from way back when. Hey, I got a question for you.
Gino Fausto.
Yeah.
In person. How are you, my friend?
In person. I've listened to you a few times now. Hey,
All right.
question for you, Mark.
And you remember the 80s, right?
Vividly, and I agree with your Cyndi Lauper and Madonna comment.
Well said. Thank you. Great answer.
You're welcome. Hey, question for you. The guys that signed the FISA warrants to search or to look at Carter Page and all those guys.
Yeah.
What are the repercussions for false FISA signatures? You know, they were signing those FISAs. Maybe the first one was questionable, but the second, third, and fourth. What are the repercussions for those individuals that were signing the FISA warrants? Are there any kind of like disbarment, or how's that going to be handled from here on out if it was illegal for them to be signing those FISAs and they can prove it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I can think of three consequences right off the bat. And the first is when you're an attorney or you're an agent and you're signing an affidavit of probable cause, or in this case the FISA affidavit, you are swearing an oath, and if you make a material false statement in that affidavit, you are making an unsworn falsification to authorities, or which is a crime. And people have been charged with falsifying affidavits and search warrants and such. It can be considered a criminal act, number one. Number two, you can get into a lot of trouble from the judge presiding. And the judge could take action against the attorney who has submitted a false affidavit into court. An attorney who's falsified the affidavit could be subject to contempt of court and sanctions. And then thirdly, of course, the disciplinary enforcement rules of the disciplinary board in charge of that jurisdiction could take action against the lawyer's law license for falsifying evidence in court.
I agree with you there. For those who have government-issued licenses in certain other areas that have made egregious errors like these fellas did, secondly on the second, third, and fourth signing of the FISAs, I believe that disbarment should be talked about and discussed and gone after. They should lose their ability to practice law if they're going to do these kind of actions.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. And the skeptic in me will says it's such a draconian, a grave consequence, and do our disciplinary boards, do our courts, do our law enforcement officials really crack the whip and come down hard on lawyers and law enforcement officials who break the law in the course of their duties? I'm not so sure they always do. But on the other hand, we went through this a few years ago with the then incumbent Attorney General Kathleen Kane, who violated the rules of the grand jury, committed a crime by leaking grand jury information. She was charged with a crime, convicted, went to jail, and was disbarred. So it can happen. It certainly can.
Yeah, I think the disbarment. I know if I made a mistake, not a mistake, if I intentionally made a decision like these guys did, I would lose my license immediately. There wouldn't be a question. And these guys falsified that information. There's no other way they signed 2, 3, and 4. And all the reason why, it was the linchpin to get into Carter Page to do the second level search, which put them right into the campaign.
That's
There's
right.
no other way to look at it but that way. So.
That's the right way. Gino Fausto from Murraysville, thanks for calling. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to your family.
You too, buddy.
All right,
Take
Happy
care.
New Year. Thanks. That's an old friend of mine, Gino from Murraysville, Pennsylvania, right outside of the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Happy to hear from him. And I'm also happy to hear he agrees with my analysis of the totally amazing 80s and that Madonna sucks and Cyndi Lauper rules. And remember, that's the test question to my friends out there in the greater Camp Hill area at the Vlad and Bethany Serdar's totally amazing 1980s birthday bash last night. Many of the guests there said that they're avid followers and listeners of the Mark Scarinci Show. So we shall see. It's a cold and dreary day out there, so you all should be sitting at home next to the fireplace, keeping warm and turning on the dial on your radios. I don't know if the radios still have dials. I guess they don't anymore. We don't really turn on dials, so I've got to come up with a new catchphrase apparently. But listening to the Mark Scarinci Show here on WHP 580 and iHeartRadio, and we heard from a very intelligent caller out there in the Pittsburgh area, making the astute observation that we have lawyers and law enforcement officials who are falsifying affidavits, warrants presented to the FISA court, which is a top secret counterintelligence court, which for many years, when I first ran for a political office back in 2012, I talked about abolishing the FISA court. I warned about that court would be used for partisan political purposes because it's top secret and it's almost unaccountable, and that individuals in the deep state, so to speak, would use that court because they have so much power and because they're largely unaccountable. They would use it for partisan political purposes, and that court should be abolished. It violates the Fourth Amendment as it is. And here we have it. Here we have a bunch of paid-for, fabricated junk, gossip, rumor, innuendo, much of it just made up by Mr. Steele, a British foreign agent who is a Trump hater. And he did this because he was being paid to do it by Hillary Clinton, the woman who was running against Donald Trump for the presidency. That's part of the Steele dossier, and it became in the Fusion GPS, which was the company paid by Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee to hire Christopher Steele. They cooperated, the executives there at Fusion GPS, Nellie Orr, one of their employees, the wife of Bruce Orr, one of the highest-ranking members of the Justice Department. They cooperated, colluded between the Obama Justice Department and FBI and Fusion GPS and Hillary Clinton's campaign, the Democratic National Committee, and a foreign agent to interfere in the 2016 presidential election by fabricating BS, fake dirt on Donald Trump, and they presented that 4 times to a FISA court, knowingly and intentionally. And the individuals involved in that, and James Comey signing off on those warrants, Those men, those lawyers should be disbarred, and hopefully they will be charged criminally by John Durham, the U.S. Attorney from Connecticut. And I'll tell you, I am, as I was saying to our caller, I get a little bit skeptical about members of our government investigating and prosecuting each other. I fear that in many instances, when justice could be done, it's kind of swept under the rug because it's one member of the government investigating or prosecuting another. But here we have John Durham, and we have Bill Barr, and Bill Barr has made some, I think, favorable statements in the press recently, showing that he has a broader take on this than Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General, who strangely concluded there was no bias. There was no bias in this investigation against then candidate Trump and then President Trump. How could you possibly reach that conclusion after reading the emails between Lisa Page and Peter Strzok? That is a remarkably obtuse conclusion for the Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, to reach. But that's his opinion. But I'll tell you, Bill Barr, our Attorney General, has a very different opinion. And Bill Barr is, through John Durham, they're conducting a criminal investigation. And I'm sure it's into Jim Comey, the former FBI director. Well, I'm not sure. I suspect it is. Peter Strzok, the FBI agent, Lisa Page, the FBI attorney, and others. Those three were at the center of this criminal conspiracy to use and abuse the awesome power of the national security state to take out a candidate for the presidency, and then once he won, to take out a sitting United States president. And it's probably one of the greatest shames in the history of our Department of Justice and FBI. More about the impeachment inquiry when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to The Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And welcome back to my listeners here on WHP 580 AM and iHeartRadio. If you download the app, you can listen to us from around the world, really. The Mark Scaringi Show has become international. And we had a caller from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We've had callers from California. We had that one very unpleasant liberal friend of ours from San Francisco who called a few weeks back. And we were on the topic of the impeachment of the President of the United States. We talked a little bit about the FISA court abuses, which are now well documented by the Inspector General's report. I think 13 omissions, mistakes, errors that were made. Of course, in my view, they were all intentional because those were political partisans with an agenda to take out a president, and they abused the FISA court power to do so. But we'll learn more once the Attorney General, the U.S. Attorney John Durham, and then the Attorney General Bill Barr, once they reach their conclusions and move forward with whatever it is that they decide to do. Hopefully there will be criminal charges that come out of that gross abuse of power. There is an abuse of power, by the way. And by the way, on the issue of abuse of power, Professor Jonathan Turley, a liberal professor who voted against President Trump in 2016, and a Democrat, he spoke and testified, remember, at that House Judiciary Committee hearing in opposition to impeachment. And he made the point that we touched upon earlier in the show today, and that is what the Democrats are doing with their obstruction of Congress article of impeachment and their abuse of power article of impeachment. The Congress itself, Democrats who voted in favor of these impeachment articles, are themselves abusing the power of their office. They're abusing the impeachment power by bringing groundless and baseless allegations of impeachment against the sitting president of the United States. And certainly with regard to the obstruction of Congress article of impeachment, that is just so wrong. It's just remarkable to me that how wrong that is, that the Democrats in the Congress didn't even use the judicial branch to attempt to enforce those subpoenas, get a ruling from a court as to the lawfulness and legality of those subpoenas. Didn't even make the attempt. Had they done that, and the president still defied those subpoenas, then you would have a real problem. Then you would have the president in contempt of court, and you might have grounds then to impeach him. But none of that even happened because the Democrats decided it would get in the way of their 2020 presidential nomination contest. That is just stunning, stunningly partisan, and reveals what this entire impeachment process is. And by the way, we were talking about the totally awesome or totally amazing 1980s party, and my friends who declare that they're avid listeners to the Mark Scaringi Show. Those of you who are texting me right now about what we're doing later on tonight at the boxing match, do you not realize I am on live radio right now and I can't really get to your texts? So that is a little bit of evidence there that you're not actually listening to the Mark Scaringi Show every Saturday at 1, but we'll talk more about that later. Our law firm, Scaringi Law, is a co-sponsor of a big professional boxing match in Harrisburg tonight. So any of my listeners who are boxing fans, we've got the real deal here in Harrisburg at the Zembo Shrine. This evening's doors open at 6 p.m. The bouts, I think there are 7 or 8 bouts, start at 7 o'clock, and it should be a good time for all. It is being put together by Titans Boxing Promotions and our local doctor, the good doctor, Dr. Andrew Foy, who is a strong boxing proponent and has done a lot to bring both amateur boxing and professional boxing back to Harrisburg. But enough on that. We're a little bit sidetracked into the totally amazing 80s party and the boxing bouts that are going to occur here in Harrisburg tonight. And getting back to the topic of today's show, the impeachment of the President of the United States. And remember, it was after repeated promises from the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee that they would not impeach any president on a partisan vote. I mean, how many times did Gerald Nadler, how many times did Nancy Pelosi say that they would not go through the impeachment process because of how divisive it is, how it will divide the nation and tear us asunder? They would never do that to the American people. They would never do that to the republic if they didn't have bipartisan support for their impeachment. They said it many, many times. But lo and behold, we now have a purely partisan impeachment. So on their face, Democrats are two-faced about this issue. The Democratic vote in the House Judiciary Committee was on a strictly party line vote. 23 Democrat votes in favor of impeachment and 17 Republican votes against impeachment. You can't get any more partisan or party line than that. Now, one late development in this impeachment issue I'd like to address, and that is the issue of Mitch McConnell, the majority leader of the United States Senate. And I don't know if any of my friends and listeners have watched him. I think it was on Fox News, and he did a brief interview. I think it was just a day ago. And I'll tell you, I was a little troubled by what the Senate Majority Leader said. He declared the Senate will be in complete cooperation with the President and the President's counsel in developing the rules and carrying out the trial of impeachment in the U.S. Senate. The Majority Leader added that he was taking my cues from the White House in shaping the trial. Well, those statements rubbed a lot of Democrats the wrong way, and even rubbed even a conservative like me the wrong way. House and Senate Democrats, well, they've jumped all over Mitch McConnell for those statements. On Friday's broadcast of MSNBC, The Last Word, Representative Karen Bass of California, Democrat, she called on Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell to recuse himself from the Senate's impeachment trial because of those words. Now, of course, he won't do so, But this Democratic congressman claimed the leader of the Senate has basically said he is in lockstep and he's going to coordinate with the president, who is the defendant in the trial. And so if you can imagine going into a courtroom in a trial and the foreman of the jury says, well, I'm working with the person that's being accused of the crime, and so it's completely inappropriate. McConnell should recuse himself. How can a juror coordinate with the defendant? That is corrupt. End quote. That was a quote by Representative Karen Bass, Democrat of California. Now, she is a little bit right and a little bit wrong. She characterizes Mitch McConnell, who is a U.S. Senator, as a juror in the Senate impeachment trial, and that is correct. The United States Senate sits essentially as a jury in hearing the evidence presented by the House managers for and against impeachment. But they also are the judge. This is a strange thing, this impeachment. We've experienced that when it was in the House and there was debate and confusion and disputes about what rules are to be applied, about whether the president's entitled to due process. Is this a criminal investigation? Is it a quasi-criminal investigation? Is it a civil matter? Is it political? So, the debate goes back and forth, and it has been going on back and forth since the Constitution was drafted. But the same goes for the Senate. The Senate has the sole power to try the case, and now the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, according to the Constitution, will preside. And that's because they don't want the vice president presiding over the Senate, because there would be a conflict of interest in Mike Pence, the vice president, presiding over a trial in the Senate. If the president is convicted, then the vice president becomes the president. So that's obviously a conflict of interest. But U.S. senators, when they sit in a trial of impeachment of a president, are both the judge and the jury. Now, the Chief Justice will preside, and he will make some level of rulings, of evidentiary rulings, procedural rulings, as such, but he can be overruled by the Senate by a majority vote. It's a remarkable and a unique. I guess it is a unique. We kind of overuse the word unique, but here it is. This is a unique court proceeding. I use the word court, but it's the Senate. And so this Democratic Congresswoman I think she's a little bit right when she says that Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, who will be both a judge and a juror in the Senate impeachment trial, stating that he is taking his cues from the president in deciding how the impeachment will run. I think that's somewhat problematic. I think that's a mistake, and I think that the Majority Leader should back down from that. I think that he is harming the president's case when he announces that he's essentially going to be following the dictates of the president in constructing this trial. One reason why the polls flipped on impeachment, if you'll recall when Nancy Pelosi spoke into existence the House impeachment inquiry, the polls were in favor of impeachment. Once the American people watched the impeachment hearings, the polls flipped. The American people are now against the impeachment because they believe it's been entirely unfair to this president. But now if Republicans in the Senate, if they give off the impression that they are biased one way or another, that could harm the president's position. Well, that's all the time we have today for the Mark Scaringi Show. Thanks for listening.